Hello and welcome to A Critical Dragon, where I talk about narrative in film, television, and in books. And this is another episode of looking at narrative, different ways to look at narrative, different ways to understand reading. And obviously, people have described me as a narratologist, and I have a certain affinity for a structural approach to some analysis. I quite like looking at the structures of a story and how it plays out, how different things relate to each other. But that's not the only way to do something, because one of the other things that I do on the channel is quite often I do close readings, which is textual analysis, which is a completely different school of analysis. It's the antithesis in a lot of ways of structuralism. And you go, but AP, how can you do both? And you go, because I pick and choose what I'm using when I'm using it. Sometimes I use structural analysis to find a scene, and then I use close reading techniques or other techniques to analyze that scene. Sometimes I use close reading techniques to find bits of information out, and then I apply structural reading to it. I take actions that characters commit. I strip away all of the language to get to the essence of the action, because I can do that to another character and go, oh, look, these two characters are actually mirroring each other. And then when you add the information back in again, you can see how the narrative, the narrator, has tried to communicate that to us or tried to hide that from us. I use multiple forms of critical analytical techniques as and when, as the mood takes me, but usually for a specific reason. And the reason I bring this up is quite often we forget, because we're used to reading. Let me put it this way. Because we're used to reading, you get your book and you sit down and you read it and you go, I didn't like that book is bad. And you set it to the side. Because what we're focusing on there is reading as consumption of narrative, and we're looking solely at reader interaction as the guiding principle of what's going on. We're not trying to understand the text. We're just focused on our own feelings. Now, if I describe that as egocentric, this is not pejorative. This is saying that we are focused on ourselves. If I described it as selfish, that would be pejorative. But this is egocentric. It's focused on the self, that we're focused on our experience, to the exclusion of other readers' experience, to the exclusion of what the author wanted the book to do, to the exclusion of what the book was trying to do. And the reason I bring this up is quite often we say, it did not meet my expectations, or I expected it to do this, and when it didn't, I was disappointed. So again, we've taken a very egocentric view about the reader experience, our personal reader experience, and that is our defining view of what the book is. Another way of doing it, if you think, I was talking just a few minutes ago about close reading. Close reading absolutely ignores the reader. I'm not considering the reading experience at all. I'm looking at the language, a very close analysis of the language, and I'm paying really particular attention to it. And I'm trying to tease out connotations and subtext and all these different things that are going on a linguistic level or a grammatical level, a syntactical level. I'm playing with all of those things and I'm trying to extract this information, and I'm focused solely on the text. I'm not considering the reading experience. I'm certainly not considering authorial intent. What I'm looking at is what's on the page. But another way of doing it is looking at, well, this text was written in a certain time period and it reflects certain cultural attitudes, and it was written in a certain country within a certain geopolitical context. And as soon as I bring that information in, and I'm then going through and reinterpreting, say, symbols, because I am aware of when it was written and who wrote it, and perhaps one of the reasons why they wrote it, I'm bringing in authorial information. Because texts don't just magically appear. Texts are written, they are created. They are created in a time and a place by someone. Sometimes they're co-written, sometimes they're written by multiple people, but for the sake of argument, we're going to say an author. So for instance, H.G. Wells wrote a short story called The Land Ironclads. And if you're reading it now, you go, what's the big deal about this story? Because in it, the story is basically the nobles of a sort of generic, bland, hierarchical culture ride forth, and they have their cavalry sabers and they're on their horses, and it's all very grand, noble, uh, warlike, but of a certain sort of warrior way, valor, all that sort of stuff. And they're faced against an urban proletariat army who have risen up because they're being badly mistreated by the nobles. And they're in these strange mechanisms that they call land ironclads. Because, of course, ironclad was a type of ship, but this is a ship on land. So it is a big, heavily armored thing on land with gun ports that rolls over the ground, and they mow down the cavalry. And you go, okay, so if that's the story, why is it an important story? And you go, well, for a start, it was written about 50 years before tanks were invented. Secondly, it was about the mechanization of warfare versus the running forward and hitting each other in one-on-one combat. It was about the idea that technology was going to change the shape of warfare and turn it into something deeply impersonal and all about the efficiency of killing. That's a big point to it. All of these things come into play and become more important when you understand they were written 50 years before tanks were invented. Writing this story now, not quite as impressive, and we would be looking for why the story was written now and what the author was trying to say. But to write it before tanks get invented, before a lot of these things happened, when we saw the initial advent of a Gatling gun being used in warfare, when World War I showed us how dehumanized warfare had become, how impersonal it had become. All of these things H.G. Wells was writing about before they became mainstream. And that's one of the reasons why that story is important. But you only know that if you know it was written by H.G. Wells and you know when he wrote it and you know a little bit about his political beliefs. So these are basically the 3 points of a triangle. And as luck would have it, I happen to have one that I made earlier. Cue graphic, or somewhere. Look at this fancy graphic that I did all by myself. It's absolutely terrible. I'm sure you can find better versions of this kind of stuff online. But just for the purpose of this is what I've done. So again, you can see those 3 points that I was just talking about. Text. If we focus solely on the text, we're in that bottom right-hand corner. If we focus just on what the author was and what the author was doing, we're in the bottom left-hand corner. And if we're just talking about our own personal experience, we're in the very top, up where it says reader. But generally, all of those points are connected. You can take the most extreme point, but more likely we're going to fall somewhere between those 3 points, somewhere in that blue triangle, which is our understanding of the text. And that's because a text is not fixed. The text itself is fixed, but that's a better way of putting it. The text might be fixed, but the meaning of the text changes. It changes according to the reader perspective. It changes according to our understanding of the author or our understanding of the text, where we move within that triangle, what we privilege in terms of information within that triangle, what we emphasize and what we de-emphasize. So if we take something like Bram Stoker's Dracula, we can look at it. I didn't enjoy that book. We'd be way up close to the top of the triangle. It's really, any discussion we have there is about how we felt about it. It's going to be close to the reader experience and not really considering the text itself or the author itself. If we then say, well, one of the things I didn't enjoy was I didn't enjoy the epistolary style because it really broke up my enjoyment, because we have sections that are meant to be representative of newspaper stories and diary entries and letters, as well as this is meant to be a transcript that one of the characters is taking. Again, we're very close to reader, but now we're engaged with aspects of things that are going on in the text. So we've moved down towards text, but we're not paying attention to anything about the author. So we're still over on that far right-hand side somewhere. But if we say, but what we have here with the diary entries, and it's interesting because obviously this is part of the technology of the time, and this when we think of telegrams being used, that's actually cutting edge technology when Stoker was writing. We've suddenly moved down across to closer to author now because we're bringing in stuff about the time period. And that's how, when we think about text and when we talk about texts, we're actually negotiating within that sort of framework of these bits of information or these focal points of types of information within a text. Because our understanding of narrative, our understanding of the text is happening in our own head. And we pick and choose what it is that we want to focus on and how we want to focus on it. And so when an academic says, I'm going to use a feminist lens or a post-colonial lens, or I'm going to apply a close reading technique, what that academic is doing is signaling upfront, yes, I know there's a lot more information in that triangle, but I'm locating it in a certain part of this triangle and I'm putting a lens over it. So that blue color, I'm just going to pick out now individual pixels of that because that's what I want to focus on and that's what I want to talk about. But when we're in general discourse, we tend to talk about it in general, the book, which means we're referring to the big triangle. So this is why I say how we approach text is very important, bearing in mind what it is that we want the text to do, what it is that the text itself is doing, and what the author intended it to do. All of these things intersect to give us our understanding of the narrative. And we can read that narrative multiple times, and we can choose different positions within that triangle. We can choose to stand there, and we will get a different understanding of the text. We will see it in a different light. So that's what I wanted to bring up today, because how we approach a text, what we expect a text to do, what a text is actually doing, what the author wanted it to do, are all different ways of understanding the text. And we can emphasize or de-emphasize all of it, certain elements of it, lots of it, only a little tiny bit of each of those different perspectives. And that gives us our own unique subjective interpretation of the text. And that's why, yes, analysis is subjective, but it occurs within a finite framework. It's not that texts can mean absolutely anything. It can only mean something within that framework, because that's all there is. There's the text, what the author intended, and the time period in which the author was writing, and what the reader is getting from it and the reader experience. That's the limitation of what that text can mean. It cannot mean absolutely everything. It's going to be in that triangle. So yes, it is subjective, but it is not infinitely subjective. Can it be objective? To a certain extent, because the reason we do textual analysis, the reason that we focus on those close readings and that textual analysis, was part of a movement within literary criticism called the New Critics, to apply a more scientific, objective rationale to analysis. So it wasn't just about how we felt when we read it. It was actually something that the majority of people, if they applied the same technique, would get to the same answer. And as time goes on, we move between dominant modes and unfavorable modes. We move through periods of time where one mode of reading or one approach to reading is viewed as better or more common than others. But ultimately, we're always working within that triangle, within what the text can possibly do. And if we bear that in mind, we can actually enjoy texts a lot more, because instead of always focusing on what I individually want a text to do, what my expectations are, if I stop myself having that mindset, if I take a step back from that and go, no, I want to see what a text is actually doing, and I start paying attention to those points more, I am more likely to get what the author was intending, but they may or may not succeed. There's no guarantee. If I am a bit aware of the context of when and how it was written, that might add to my experience. But if I focus solely on what my reading experience is, it is incredibly subjective. It is very egocentric, and it denies me as a reader access to that, the vast majority of what is going on in that blue triangle, because I'm not paying attention to the author and when the book was published and how it was intended to be read and what the audience was intended to be. I'm not paying attention to what the text is actually doing and what's on the page. All I'm focusing on is how I felt about it or what it did to me. And that is going to limit the applicability of my analysis. So I hope you can see from that diagram. I mean, it sounds weird. It sounds complicated. It's hard to wrap our heads around because it's not how we generally approach text when we say, oh, I'm just sitting down to read. I just want to be entertained. But that's one of the ways that you can actually become much more flexible in your reading. And things that would frustrate you if you were reading solely for entertainment can suddenly hold your attention and be really interesting and engage you, because it's not just about, oh, did a fun thing happen on the page? When things upset you as a reader because you go, oh, that's really terrible, sometimes you can take a step back from that and actually engage with what the author was intending us to have, which protects us from feeling upset and helps us understand and rationalize and process complex or difficult or horrendous things that have happened on the page. All of these allow us a flexibility in how we read, if we so choose. So I hope you've enjoyed this little chat. You know, your mileage may vary. Thank you very much for watching, and I will see you in the next one.